It would.
Can I borrow yours?
Dirty dogs. All my candy stick messages are being preached now across the world. I guess that's what's supposed to happen. Miss Valerie? Now, what are you drinking, honey? Coffee or Coke or what? Water.
I'm a heavy drinker.
A mixed drinker, too. All right. I think we should all be here. You want me to wait for you, James? Huh? Okay, I'm on. Let's continue. I didn't get to Nahum last time. I'll try to get to that when we'll try to be slack or less on some of the others. I want to get to some of the other studies, and one of them in particular is Zephaniah, which I want to come up with in just a moment. Nahum, and the purpose for this was to announce the destruction. Basically, Nahum has one focus, to announce the destruction of the city of Nineveh. Now, this is about 150 years after Jonah was in Nineveh, and there had been a revival in Nineveh. So this is about 150 years later when Nahum is going to teach, and then his focus is going to be on the city of Nineveh and its destruction. But basically, the purpose also is showing the Jewish people that he is in control. You either do what he tells you to do, or he is going to judge you, and he's going to judge Nineveh. And it's after God's messenger, Nahum, gives this message about 100 years later that is going to be the case, and the city of Nineveh is actually going to be destroyed. And let me just remind you, when these prophets give prophecies, they have three ways that they possibly could be fulfilled. Number one, they could be filled in the short term. In other words, it could be within hours, it could be within days and months, within a short period of years. They have a long-term fulfillment, which would be considered for the last days, and the prophecies being fulfilled in this period of time in which we're living, as it said there in Micah chapter 4 and verse 1, and in the last days. That's pretty simple to understand. And then the other possibility, it could have a short-term and a long-term fulfillment. In other words, double fulfillment. You've got to read the context. But as we read some of these verses that I'm pointing out to you that we're studying, let me just show you verse 15 here in chapter 1. This is one of the long-term fulfillments. Verse 15, chapter 1 of Nahum. Behold upon the mountains the feet of him that bringeth good tidings, that publish peace. Of course, that's Jesus Christ. Who Judah, O Judah, keep thy solemn feast. In other words, continue to do your Jewish feast. The 7 feasts in the book of Leviticus, those are for Jewish people. They are not for Christians to observe. We can study them, we can teach them, but not observe them. They're Jewish feasts, and there's 7 of them: Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost. Those are the 4 in the spring. And then in the fall, you have Feast of Trumpets, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So the exhortation from Nahum is, it's going to happen in the future, but keep your feast. Do you know that the book of Zechariah, chapter 14, when we get there to this session today, we're going to observe the Feast of Tabernacles forever on the earth in Jerusalem. That's one of the feasts in the millennial kingdom and into eternity future. And so he's exhorting them, keep your feast, your solemn feast, perform thy vows, for the wicked shall no more pass through thee, he is utterly cut off. So this is a prophecy with a long-term fulfillment, but a present-day exhortation. Very, very key. In the book of Nahum, chapter 2, and look at verse 13. Behold, I am against thee, saith the Lord of hosts, and I will burn her chariots in the smoke, and the sword shall devour thy young lions, and I will cut off the prey from the earth, and the voice of thy messenger shall no more be heard. Now that is talking about, and it's a prophecy. Here's a short-term fulfillment, which is going to be fulfilled within 100 years, because it is going to, the prophecy of Nahum that Assyria's or Nineveh is going to be destroyed. It is going to be destroyed, and this is an absolute guarantee, and it shows the Jewish people that God is still in control. So that's a short-term fulfillment. And that passage of Scripture dealing with it, chapter 17, chapter 18 of 2 Kings, chapter 19, 35, if you want to get the exact place, is where they came into into Judah, the southern tribes, and they were going to try to wipe out Judah as well, these Assyrians, and 185,000 of them were killed that night. Chapter 19 of 2 Kings, Jim looked it up and corrected me, chapter 19 and verse 35. And so that is key. As we study God's Word, look again here in chapter 3 and verse 19. There is no healing of thy bruise, thy wound is grievous. All that hear the bruit of thee shall clamp the hands over thee, for upon whom hath not thy wickedness passeth continually. It's talking about the fact that the city of blood, the city of Nineveh, is going to be destroyed, just like the Bible tells it will be. Across the page is the book of Habakkuk. The book of Habakkuk. And go with me over to chapter 3. Book of Habakkuk, it basically is a conversation between the Lord and the prophet himself. In chapter 1, the prophet is very depressed. Hey, why is this all happening? Why are these bad things happening to good people all the time, Lord? So that's chapter 1, he's depressed. Chapter 2, the Lord gives him an exhortation. Hey, just look at what's going on. Look what I have planned. In chapter 3, the rejoicing or the glorification of what the Lord had done. Now look with me at verses 18 and 19 of Habakkuk chapter 3. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like hinds' feet, and he will make me to walk upon my high places, to the chief singer of the stringed instruments. He finally is gone from the pits to the mountaintop. And that's what the book of Habakkuk is all about. Be a blessing for you to study Habakkuk. And again, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I get at least some of the major truths that I want to show you in Bible prophecy in. You may have the problem, how do you pronounce the name of the book? Habakkuk or Habakkuk? I pronounce it Habakkuk. To me, it's Habakkuk. To you, it may Habakkuk. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Just kind of be able to fill in the blanks in your syllabus here. Book of Zephaniah. The book of Zephaniah. Zephaniah is a contemporary of Jeremiah, and both of them are prophesying before the exile, before the Babylonian captivity. Do you remember I told you 2 of the prophets of these 17 prophesied during the Babylonian captivity? That's Daniel and Ezekiel. 3 prophesy after the Babylonian captivity. That's Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And all the rest prophesied before the Babylonian captivity. So Zephaniah, a contemporary with Jeremiah, is basically warning them of the 70 years that's coming. Remember, Jeremiah 25:11 and 29:10 says it would be a 70-year period of time that the Jewish people would be taken out of the Jewish land because they did not rest their land for a 490-year period of time. And divide that by 70, you get 70 years, and that's why they're out of the land, to fulfill the prophecy of Jeremiah that the children of Israel will rest the land, give a sabbatical, give a Shabbat to the land. Leviticus chapter 25 is the command for them to be able to do that. And so we see this is the case. Go here in chapter 1 And look at verse 18. Neither their silver nor their gold shall be able to deliver them in the day of the Lord's wrath, but the whole land shall be devoured by the fire of his jealousy, for he shall make even a speedy riddance of all that dwell in the land. Here's an exhortation. This is an exhortation of what's coming. Again, a prophecy talking to the Jewish people about the Babylonian captivity that is going to take place. Go to chapter 2. Notice what it says here. Gather yourselves, verse 1, gather yourselves together, ye gather together, O nation not desired. By the way, that's the Jewish state, not desired in this time, not desired in that time. Verse 2, before the decree bring forth, before the day pass on the shaft, before the fierce anger of the Lord come down upon you, before the day of the Lord's anger come upon you, seek ye the Lord, all ye meek of this earth, which have wrought his judgment. Seek righteousness, seek meekness. It may be ye shall be hid in the day of the Lord's anger. He's trying to get the people. Zephaniah is trying to, as the weeping prophet Jeremiah, say, you Jews, wake up. You're not resting in the land. You haven't done it for 490 years. God's going to take care. Look, God does these things. He says, here's what I want you to do. And we don't do it, and then he comes in and does it himself. I am almost sick and tired of being hit by a 2x4. He has to do that sometimes to get my attention. And he says, you're not going to do what I'm telling you to do. I'm going to do it. I found out at almost 80 years of age, I found out it's a lot easier to do what he says instead of being beat up all the time. And that's what Zephaniah in these first 3 verses of chapter 2 is trying to say. Go to chapter 3 and verse 9. Let me show you. This is really interesting. Chapter 3 and verse 9. Therefore, as I live, saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, surely Moab shall be as Sodom, and the children of Ammon as Gomer. Even be the breeding of needles and salt pits, and the perpetual desolation and residue of my people shall spoil them, and the remnant of my people shall possess it. This is the judgment that's coming upon these Jewish people. That's in chapter 2. Now chapter 3, and go to verse 9. I was reading verse 9 in chapter 2. Chapter 3, look what it says here. For then will I turn to the people a pure language, that they may call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent. You know what that's talking about? The revival of the Hebrew language. For 2,000 years, Hebrew was not a spoken language. It was not used in daily conversation, communication. It was not used in any type of a relationship with the people. The only time it was ever used was maybe seldom at the synagogue. They would use some Hebrew, which kept it just barely in existence. But it was basically wiped out. In the book of Jeremiah, where we see the New Covenant, chapter 31, and verse 23, it says, I will return unto you the Hebrew language, the language that blesses me. Here in Zephaniah 3:9, he says, I will give you back the language. Look at it again. Verse 9, for then will I turn to the people a pure language, that may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent. The Jewish people now speaking the Hebrew language because that's the language that blesses God. I believe, and I think we could, and I'm not going to take the time, but we could prove that Hebrew was that one language in Babel. And the Lord discombobulated that language and made it into many other languages to divide the people because they weren't being obedient. That's that 2x4. You won't do what I told you because you've got one language and in your mind you can think of all these things. So I'm going to discombobulate that language and give you a multiplicity of languages. I believe the language we'll speak in eternity future is the Hebrew language. Since the day in Babylon, 4,500 years ago to today, there has not been the Hebrew language, the pure language, to dress and honor and bless the Lord. He said, I'm going to give it back to you. You know how that happened? There was a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda. He was a righteous man. He wasn't a Christian. He was an Orthodox Jew. He lived in Europe and he immigrated to Israel. He immigrated to the city of Beersheba, which is about halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And he had just gotten married. And he married this beautiful lady and he brought her to Israel. They were living there in Beersheba. And they were having a conversation one day, and Eliezer said to her, hey, look, we're the chosen people living in God's chosen land. I think we ought to speak God's chosen language. And she said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I got pieces of Hebrew that I was able to kind of retain in my thinking from my worship at the synagogue. And there were little portions, you know, small portions that I repeated every time I was there. So he said, I'm going to teach you that Hebrew. And we're going to raise our children when they're born speaking the Hebrew language. They started doing that. He started to develop new words. There were some words that weren't in the Hebrew. And he said, wow, let me see. Oh, I think I could start an institute. We don't have a word for telephone. Our automobile. And so he started an institute, developed those new words. And then his neighbors came to him and said, hey, we want to speak Hebrew as well. If you're speaking Hebrew, that's the language of our people. The land of this nation of Jewish people should be speaking Hebrew. So he started an institute. And UPAM is what they call it, where you teach Hebrew to the new immigrants that come in. Every new immigrant coming into the land has to spend 1 year studying Hebrew. And the technique they use to teach Hebrew is the best in the world. You totally absorb yourself. Ricky's wife, Sarah, speaks fluent Spanish because her job required that she be able to speak Spanish because of all the Hispanic people that live in this area. She has to be able to counsel with them. And so what they would do before they had children, Sarah would go down and the government would pay for her to go down for 2 months to South America and go to a location and just live with a Spanish family, a Hispanic family. And they didn't speak any English. And by observation and by just being totally engrossed with that language, that's how she learned the language. That's exactly what they do in Israel. The UPAM is teaching. So they had an institute, develop new words. They had a UPAM to teach these words, and then they started spreading the news that here's how you learn the language. And so that's how Hebrew was once again revived. Eliezer ben Yehuda. If you go to Israel, the main walking street in Jerusalem is called Ben Yehuda Street, named in honor of this man. The pure language the Jewish people speak, that's a tangible evidence of the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Tangible evidence of the fact that God was going to raise up that language. Well, look with me in chapter 3 of Zephaniah and verse 20. Chapter 3 and verse 20. At that time will I bring you again, even in the time that I gather you, for I will make you a name and a praise among all people of the earth when I turn back your captivity before your eyes, saith the Lord. Short term, long term. Short term, at the end of the Babylonian captivity. Long term, today. There is double fulfillment in that verse of Scripture that was given to Zephaniah, contemporary of Jeremiah, and to the Jewish people today. So interesting how all of these prophets come forth with what we need to understand about the prophetic scenario that's laid out in God's Word. Well, let me look at Haggai with you, if you will. Book of Haggai. These three prophets we're going to look at next are the last three prophets in the Old Testament. But they're also the prophets that were prophesying that the Lord was using in prophetic ministry after the exile was over, after the return of the Jews to the land. And that had been promised. Jeremiah said that would be the case. They would come back into the land. Zephaniah is making the same statement here, chapter 3 and verse 20. We just looked at it. But when you look at the book of Ezra, we see a number of prophecies. In chapter 1, we see the fulfillment of prophecy given 150 years before the fact by Isaiah, chapter 44 and chapter 45. Last verse in chapter 44 of Isaiah, first verse of chapter 45 in the book of Isaiah, it's talking about the Lord's servant. His name would be Cyrus. And Cyrus would come back into the land, and he would allow the Jews to return to the land. And in fact, he would allow them to go rebuild the temple. And in fact, he would, in that time, assist them through financial assistance. I've got to tell you, this was the leader of the Persian Empire at that time in history. That's a very exciting time when the Persians were on the side of the Jewish people. Not today. Modern day Persia is Iran today. Until 1936, that piece of real estate was called Persia. In fact, they still speak the Persian language there. It was then changed to Iran. Actually, it was divided into three parts: Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. That was the original Persian Empire. And when they changed the name, hell broke loose from Iran until today, and we know what's going on today. The Sanhedrin, the 70 wise Jewish scholars, have been so excited about what Cyrus did. They minted a half silver shekel that would be used as the temple tax when they put the temple up. Now I have it over here. Let me just point it out to you. I'll be right back in the camera, folks. I didn't pass away and the rapture hasn't happened. Just wait a moment. I got to bring it to the table. I have that half silver shekel right here in my hand. This is going to be the temple tax when the temple's up. And you know, the Sanhedrin would be the group, the 70 wise Jewish scholars, and they've been reformed in Israel itself, and they're to direct all the activity to rebuild the temple. The replication of the new, of all the implements in the temple, the table of showbread, the altar of incense, and the menorah, etc. They were responsible for that. They were responsible for making certain that all the priestly garments have been made. The red heifer, they're in charge of that. The Sanhedrin are major players. And so they minted this silver half shekel. And on one side of it is the temple, which they project. Now, one of the problems is this is Herod's temple. And that's the temple that they're going to build in the tribulation period. That's not Messiah's temple. Ezekiel 40 to 46 describes Messiah's temple, the one he will build. This tribulation temple, see, there's two temples in the future. The tribulation temple, the Messiah's temple for the millennial kingdom. The temple for the tribulation period is from Herod. Maimonides, the great Jewish sage, wrote a book describing Herod's temple. And that's what they've been following, the Temple Institute, the Sanhedrin. They've been following that in order to put up the temple that will be, as we know it, they think it's the temple which is going to bring Messiah, that temple that will be in the tribulation period, the one that will be desecrated by the Antichrist. Oh, by the way, they will accept the Antichrist as the true Messiah. So you got a false temple for a false Messiah to a false people. And so this is a silver shekel for that temple. On this side, that's Herod's temple. That's not the one for Messiah. And on this side, you have the menorah. You can look at it later. And you have a profile shot of Cyrus. They so honor Cyrus. They put his profile on this half silver shekel. Oh, there's somebody else on that silver shekel. Another man they honor because of his relationship with Jerusalem. Donald Trump, whoever's speaking out, I'm doing the teaching. I use a prophetic pause. So don't give my answer till I give it, please. Thank you very much. Donald Trump. Those wannabe prophecy teachers back there in the back. Donald Trump is right there. So if you want to see this half silver shekel, I'll leave it up here. And it better be up here when everybody looks at it. And I leave this building. That is what we're seeing unfold. And so this is looking towards the temples in the future. Tribulation temple, millennial temple. But wait a minute. We're in Haggai. Haggai is the prophet, and his contemporary was Zechariah. Haggai and Zechariah. They both have a ministry after the exile to exhort the Jewish people, wake up, friends, wake up. You've come back into the land. They got out of the Babylonian captivity in 539 BC. Now we're looking at a period of time, almost 20 years later, and it's going to take them 5 more years to build the next temple. What are they doing? They're building their own home places. And so God raises up Haggai and Zechariah. If you read the book of Ezra, and the book of Ezra from chapters 1 over to chapter 6 is the rebuilding of the temple. You got it? Chapters 1 to 6. You know where you put Haggai when you're reading chronologically to the Bible? Quit messing around, boys. You know what you're doing when you read the book of Ezra? You put Haggai and Zechariah in chapter 5. That's where you place these 2 prophets. These guys were contemporaries, but they were so opposite, it's unbelievable. For example, Zechariah was a young, suave, good-looking guy, somebody like Rich Smith here, who is out there doing prophecy. Haggai was a crusty old man, like me. And so this was the comparison with these 2, but both of them were having an effective ministry to get the people to wake up and build the temple. Actually took them 25 years from the time they were released in 539 BC, and the temple was built in about 515 BC. Now, that was what we would refer to, remember in Ezra, Cyrus gave permission to Zerubbabel to take the Jewish people, about 50,000, 49,897 to be exact, to take them back to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. He sent money with them to fund that rebuilding of the temple. When they got back, it took them 25 years before they ever put anything of a semblance of a temple up, and it was so simple. Do you have any idea what King Solomon's temple was like? You know, the main implements in the temple, the Holy of Holies, table of showbread, altar of incense, and the menorah. 3 pieces of furniture. In Solomon's temple, they had 10 sets of these 3 pieces of furniture. Solomon's temple was so elaborate, they could not believe how opulent it was. It was so beautiful. Now they come out of the Babylonian captivity. Here's Haggai and Zechariah telling the people to put the temple up. They've been building their own homes, and all of a sudden, the temple comes up. But I got to tell you something. It was a simple temple. Look over here to chapter 2 and verse 9. chapter 2 and verse 9. The glory of this latter house shall be greater than the former, saith the Lord of hosts. And in this place will I give peace, saith the Lord of hosts. He's talking about the temple on the Temple Mount. And he's talking about how simple the temple is. You know what they did? The temple has to be built out of special stone. And that stone cannot be cut with steel. It has to be stone to stone to cut those stones for the temple. Well, they didn't even use stone in Zerubbabel's temple. They used wood. They used wood to build the temple. It was so simple. The implements were just so unbelievably simple that people couldn't understand it. Why? We have heard, or we can remember. My great-grandmother told me about Solomon's temple before it was destroyed 70 years ago. Now, 95 years ago. And it was so simple. But the temple went up. That's the second temple. You say, well, what about Herod's temple? I thought that was, no. It's Zerubbabel's temple that was refurbished by Herod. Years, over 30 years, Herod worked at refurbishing the temple, which is referred to as Herod's temple. The second temple, in truth, bottom line, technically, it is Zerubbabel's temple. The rabbis said in Herod's time, if you'd never seen Herod's temple, you've never seen a beautiful building. Haggai is exhorting these people. They come with a temple, it's simple, they talk about the future, and Haggai will use that to excite the people of what's going to happen. Look at chapter 2, verse 23. Look at verse 23 in chapter 2 of Haggai. Well, let's start in verse 20. And again the word of the Lord came unto Haggai in the 24th day of the month, saying, Speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, I will shake the heavens and the earth. He's going to make everybody understand, I control all the creation, I can do this. Verse 22, and I will overthrow the throne of kingdoms, and I will destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the heathen, of the Gentiles, the world leaders. And I will overthrow the chariots and those that ride in them, and the horses and their riders shall come down, every one by the sword of his brother. Verse 20, this is talking about the future now. It's the long-term fulfillment. Verse 23, and in that day, saith the Lord of hosts, will I take thee, O Zerubbabel, my servant, and saith unto the Lord, and will make thee a signet, for I have chosen thee, saith the Lord of hosts. In other words, what Zerubbabel started the best he possibly could, what Herod enhanced, is going to ultimately be replicated in the tribulation period. That's what the previous verse, verse 19, was talking about. But it's going to be more majestic than anything you've ever seen as we consider the temple that Jesus Christ will build. I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to read through or study, even study, the book of Ezekiel chapters 40 to 46. It's 202 verses of detailed information. That temple, Messiah's temple, is going to be like no other place of worship for the Jewish people that has ever been in the earth's existence. For example, the tabernacle. That was the transportable worship center that they used in the wanderings in the wilderness and for about the first 400 years in the land of the promised. So they went in there, and at Shiloh for 350 years, that tabernacle stood there with the Ark of the Covenant in it. When they built Zerubbabel's temple, they built it very simple. Herod comes along and rebuilds it. But that's nothing compared to what Messiah's temple. It's very difficult to read those 202 verses in Ezekiel and understand what it's all about. I have a book written by John Schmidt, Messiah's Temple. And we do a television program. I think I have the DVD over there, Mysteries of the Temple. And John has done a model to scale for the Messiah's temple, Ezekiel. I mean, it's a wonderful piece of work. John and I stood on the Mount of Olives. Jimmy and the Day of Discovery television crew filmed us up there talking about what's up there. Now, when you go into that temple and you go into the holy place, over to the right, there's no table of showbread. That's where the showbread table's. Oh, why? Jesus said, I'm the bread of life. John 6. Oh, you look and there's no menorah, 7-branch candelabra. Oh, wow. No 7-branch. Oh, Jesus said, John 1, 46 times in the book of John, I am the light of the world. Don't need a menorah. See, every piece of instrument or implement in the temple was a foretaste or a prophecy of Jesus to go. There's no veil of the temple. Why? It went from top to bottom when he was crucified. Look in the Holy of Holies, there's no Ark of the Covenant. Well, that should not be a surprise. We read Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 18. No more will they have an Ark of the Covenant. They're not even going to talk about it anymore. Why? Because the Ark of the Covenant was a model of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, to come. And when you have the real thing, you no longer need the model. By the way, there's no there's no fence, wall of partition around the temple. Why is that? Book of Ephesians, chapter 2, verses 11 and following. There were two people at enmity, Gentile and Jew, wall of partition between them. Death, burial, and resurrection takes the wall out, makes two people one Christian. That's why you're either a Jew, Gentile, or a Christian. It's going to be a beautiful building that Christ will build himself and rule and reign from. Haggai looks forward to that time, but at the present, in his time of ministry, he's trying simply to exhort the people to build their temple at that point in time. Well, I go to Zechariah next, do that this afternoon, Zechariah and Malachi. So I don't want to get started in Zechariah now, but I'm going to give you a little extra time. Take your break and be back in here at 3:30 for David. We'll come back at 4:30 for our last session. See you then. If you want to see this, this half shekel, come up and look at it.